The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Baker. The Nigel Scale.
Welcome back to another episode of The Age of Uncertainty. And boy, have things changed since the last episode. We are now officially homeschooling. So I'm hiding up here doing this video instead of educating my children. I hope you realise the sacrifice I'm making. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you this is at any moment we could have some uncertain interruptions from two team members of our Scrum team here. If they come in, I'll introduce them. If they don't, I won't. Let's see what happens. Hello!
Hello.
What's your name, little one?
Alice.
And how old are you?
5.
And what's your name?
Darcy, and I'm 7.
Excellent. We're here just enjoying ourselves in the office. We'll see you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I didn't expect it to happen that quickly. Welcome to the Nigel Scale. The Nigel Scale is a technique I came up with nearly a decade ago. I originally formulated it during a discussion on our online Scrum Trainer forum in the Scrum Alliance. We were having a discussion on what should go in the Certified Scrum Master curriculum in that course. What should be in, what should be out. And I realised during that discussion there was actually some fundamental misunderstandings going on. Some people were actually confusing core fundamental practice with good optional practices. And I thought we should have a conversation about this. So I invented, and I will admit, I really was kind of trolling at the time, the Nigel Scale, right? Okay, let's look at the Nigel Scale and then we can discuss what it can be used for. So the Nigel Scale itself breaks down to 3 simple areas. Area number 1 is Nigel Scale 1. This is stuff that is core, stuff that is fundamental, stuff that is, if you bend it, everything breaks. So from outside of our world, that is, if you're a surgeon, wash your hands. Okay? In fact, because of the virus at the moment, if you want to take one bit of advice from this video, wash your bloody hands. It is not optional. It is not, hey, do you know what? I don't believe in the concept of bacteria, so I don't need to wash my hands. Wash your bloody hands. Hey, I believe bacteria is good for you, so I'm going to dip my hands into this pile of cow poo and then put them into your body as I remove your spleen during surgery. Surgeons wash their hands. Surgeons disinfect their hands. This is not optional. This is not something you have a choice over. And at the moment, a lot of people are thinking this is somehow some sort of good practice. It is a fundamental core practice in the world today. Nigel Scale 1. If you bend this stuff, things horribly break. So for me, in terms of Scrum, a self-organising team. That is an absolute fundamental. Without a self-organising team, without a team that's empowered to make its own choices and decisions, we are doomed, and this stuff is just a micromanagement technique. Nigel Scale 1. Nigel Scale 2 is where it all gets a little bit fascinating. Nigel Scale 2 is the grey, ambiguous area of good practice. Now, a lot of us used to call this best practice back in the day, but as we discovered through things like Cynefin, there is no real best practice in the world of complex work, and so it's good practice. This is where, as coaches, we've got to be very careful, because this good practice works in many other organisations. It may work for us, but it may not. This is where we've got to inspect and adapt with our own core principles and beliefs to try and make sure this contextually works for us as it works for many others. So this is fascinating because a lot of what people think Scrum is, it isn't. Things like visions, user stories, task boards, even standing up in the daily Scrum. These are all things that are good practices a lot of us do, but they're not actually core fundamental practices. And then we have Nigel Scale 3. This is, if you can guess, first one was core, second one was good, third one is bad, bad, bad. The bad stuff, the anti-patterns. You know what? This stuff sucks. It's going to cause you a lot of trouble. Well, actually, we can't guarantee it will cause you a lot of trouble. You could be the organisations to make that method work. I just want to warn you though, there's a big pile of bodies out back of organisations that thought the same thing. So be afraid, be very afraid with these anti-patterns, all these bad practices. So we have Nigel Scale 1, 2 and 3. Core stuff, good stuff, bad stuff. So if I asked you product backlogs, where would you put them on that list? 1, 2 or 3? If I asked you about user stories, where would you put them on that list? 1, 2 or 3? You see, this is what makes life interesting. A lot of what people call Scrum isn't Scrum. It's in fact good practices masquerading as core practices. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, doesn't mean they're not good, but it means that they're not one size fits all. They don't apply to everyone. So now we've got this scale. Let's look at Scrum and look at how people approach Scrum through the eyes of that scale. One mistake I see a lot of people making, by the way, is confusing Nigel Scale 2 with 1. Confusing good practice with core practice. Now you may think, why is that a bad idea? If those generally accepted good practices work for those people, why can't they work for us? And that is a good point. What I would say though is my fear is making all those Nigel Scale 2s, things like stories, task boards, visioning techniques, all different ways of refining, making them ossified into a core practice. That cookbooking of this stuff could make us less flexible in the future. That ossification we spoke about in an earlier video. Or what about this then? Nigel Scale 3 masquerading as Nigel Scale 1. Bad practices masquerading as core practices. The fundamental breaking of our agile principles and approaches. I have seen that, and we're seeing more and more of that as we're developing up more diffuse and more numerous methods out there under the agile umbrella. Well, I'm afraid to say some of those things I feel don't fall under that umbrella. Especially in the world of scaling, where people are malforming Scrum to create a more scaled approach. The trouble is, malformed Scrum creates more bad things. And more bad things at scale? Well, let's put it this way. If you're making shit, and you increase the production of shit, you have, ladies and gentlemen, created diarrhea. Eek! But there are other interesting ways of looking at this as well. Thinking that things that are core or fundamental are in fact just good practice. When people get small a agile, again, maybe legitimate. You know, who says Scrum's the right answer? The trouble is people often malform this or change this through a misunderstanding of agility or a lack of a full appreciation of these techniques rather than through deep knowledge and skill. And you end up with a very wobbly agile, like a wibbly wobbly jelly. Or what about this? When people confuse core stuff with bad practice. So not making bad practice into core practice, but assuming that those core practices do not apply in their particular context. And that worries me. We mentioned self-organizing teams earlier on, but there are many enterprise agile settings out there where self-organizing teams don't happen. They're not allowed to self-organize because we're a large organization, we're FDA regulated, we're this, we're that, we're the other. But that isn't true, but it holds back their ability to deliver good products. So understanding those different ways of looking at it, I think can help us appreciate some of the fundamental patterns of mistakes, sort of meta patterns of mistakes that we're making. Treating 1 like it's 3, or 3 like it's 1, 1 like it's 2, or 2 like it's 1. This can get us into trouble. But there's another component to all this that we haven't even touched upon yet. And actually I've been doing a few talks and a few workshops on this recently. The idea of time being a factor into the Nigel scale. The idea, core, good or bad, well that's a snapshot of today and that may change over time. Let's look at that right now. Let's look at the Nigel scale over time, okay? So if we look at this here, right, I've got the Nigel scale, core, good, bad, was that Nigel scale 1, 2 or 3 over time. Now let's look at something like planning poker. Now planning poker is at Nigel scale 1, 2 or 3, core, good or bad. depends on your experience. We can all rule out it's not core, it's not in any particular agile method as a defined method, but it is a pretty good practice in new teams, right? But the trouble with planning poker is it's got a very short half-life. Decays quite quickly. So you can see here, it's got quite a short half-life. So actually, in a more mature team, something like planning poker can be seen to be a pretty poor practice. Yet in a unmature team, in a new team, it can be really quite powerful. Compare that to something like affinity-based estimation or magic estimation. Now, affinity-based estimation or magic estimation, you may have heard it under a variety of different names like that. Actually, in a new team, it's a pretty bad technique. I wouldn't do it with a new team, to be fair. I think that new team would struggle. They need to have the conversations, the communication. But it becomes pretty viable after a period of time. It becomes pretty viable. So a more mature team would get a lot of benefit from that. So the idea is, which technique's right or wrong? Well, there is no right or wrong. It depends on the context, on the maturity and the experience of the environment and the team. But what I would say is planning poker is a great introductory technique that can decay over time, and something like affinity-based estimation is a very powerful technique that teams can grow into over time. Interesting, huh? Another one we can look at is backlog refinement. Okay, so backlog refinement, there's 1,000 different ways of doing it, some good, some bad. So if we look at some of the bad ones, I think we pretty much all agree, if you do backlog refinement in your actual planning sessions, your sprint planning sessions, that sucks. Whether you're a new team, an old team, or a medium team, it sucks, right? But if we do it, let's say, once a sprint, okay, that could start off as a pretty viable technique once a sprint, pretty reasonable. I'll never say it's going to get bad, but, over time, that could decay down a bit, becomes okay-ish over time, having that one big refinement meeting every sprint. So some teams have multiple refinement meetings every sprint. Now, that could start off being a bit difficult to do, if you think about it. Actually, in a newer team, that could actually be a bit difficult, but maybe not a great practice for a brand new team. But it could become valid pretty quickly and become more valid. Maybe not core, but rising up in that way. Or then you look at what some people would call JIT planning, just-in-time planning, having no official defined meetings for refinement, just doing refinement just in time, just enough. Incredibly powerful, what I really like. But you've got to have a certain amount of context to get there. You've got to have a certain amount of skills and abilities and cross-functionality in the team to be able to achieve it. So that could be a little bit more like this. Just-in-time planning, not so valid for not valid for quite a while, and then when the conditions are in place, then it starts becoming more valid as a method, as an approach. So different types of doing refinement, some are good, some are bad, again depending on the context. You can take this sort of as Nigel graphing, as I like to call it, and apply it in a load of different ways. One other thing I'd like to look at in terms of Nigel scale is when we have an issue between core practices and good practices. So again, retrospectives. I think we can all agree they are a fundamental practice in Scrum, in fact a fundamental practice in most Agile approaches. Yet everyone seems to have real problems with them and struggle with them. Why could that be? Well, it's because actually if you look at how retrospectives work, they're a bit like, they age like milk. They decay quite quickly. Often because people get bored with the method, the techniques we use. I often joke that they've got a lifespan of 3 uses. The first time people are like, yeah. The second time they're like, yeah. And the third time they're like, yeah. And so the methods decay quickly, though the concept doesn't. So how can we use the Nigel scale to reveal that? Well, actually, look at this problem here. Decay so quickly. What we probably need to keep doing then is keep changing our retrospective method to stop it decaying too quickly. So we sort of stay up here in this space around here, where it's really value, and not heading down into this space here, the overused, dull, repetitive retro model. So this Nigel graphing technique, I think, could lead us into another interesting space that I'm not sure I'm going to have time to do in this video, but the idea of Nigel mapping. Imagine you're a little person here, the journey you want to go on. How do I keep myself as close up here as possible? By keep changing the method I'm doing to keep our practices very strong and powerful and core and fundamental rather than decay away over time. Nigel Mapping. I think someone else has coined that term. But I think that could be interesting to look at in a later video, if anyone's interested, that is. Okay, that's the end of the episode. Apologies for the sound quality issues at the start. There was a few issues with my Mac mic and I don't quite know what they were. I followed the classic IT rule of switching it off, switching it back on again, and it seemed to work for the rest of the video, but I've had to lower the volume in this video to get it to match all the way through. So if you watch another one following this, it could be a bit louder. Be careful. But apart from that, I hope it's been useful. Hope you've enjoyed it. Again, I love this topic. If you're interested in Nigel mapping, we could explore it a bit further in a later video, but I would like your feedback. And that's when I've got to ask for a favour from all of you. Could you please share these videos, whether on LinkedIn or on Twitter or other social media aspects you have? The more I can get these videos out there, the more audience I can get, the more value I feel I'm giving the world of work while we're all isolated like this. So any way you can share this stuff will be absolutely fantastic. I hope to come back with a new episode on Friday. Hopefully on a session I'm doing with a company this week, but we'll see how that goes, see if it's worthwhile broadcasting on Friday. But till then, have a safe week and wash your blooming hands. Take care. See you soon. Goodbye.
Next episode on the Age of Uncertainty, talking with Scrum Masters.